our second of 3 author programs, we're honored to welcome the New York Times bestselling novelist Megan Miranda in her first appearance from March 4th and her first ever visit to the lowcountry. The author of both adult and young adult novels, Megan has been called the queen of the psychological thriller. Her previous best-selling books include The Last House Guest, a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick, as well as All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger, The Girl from Widow Hills, and Such a Quiet Place. Her most recent novel, The Last to Vanish, is making its paperback debut here at March 4th. In its hardcover release, The Last to Vanish was named one of the most anticipated books of last year by the New York Post, Book Riot, and CrimeReads. In a star review, Booklist praised the novel as an eerie thriller, which can stand next to Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House and Stephen King's The Shining. In another starred review, Publishers Weekly said, a superb thriller. Miranda is writing at the top of her game. Her forthcoming novel, The Only Survivors, is now only a month away to be published in early April. Megan grew up in New Jersey, graduated from MIT, and now lives in North Carolina with her husband and 2 children. Megan will be interviewed by our Conroy Center's Executive Director, Jonathan Houck. Jonathan is the former director of the University of South Carolina Press and the co-editor of Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, the winner of 17 book awards. In 2020, Jonathan was honored with the Doug Marlatt Literacy Leadership Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award given by the Pulpwood Queens, the largest book club in the U.S. Please join me in welcoming Megan Miranda and Jonathan.
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you all again for being here, too. You having a good time?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Welcome to our low country, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Have you enjoyed wandering around a little bit?
I have, and I was just saying now, I definitely have to come back and bring my entire family.
That's
so
what your fruit does. Excellent, yes. It has that way of drawing people back to it as well, which is a theme we get to talk about, actually, too, the idea of being drawn to a place and what sort of magnetic forces pull people to places that we're in. But before we get into talking about either books, the job of an interviewer very often is to be the avatar of the audience. So I have to ask the question that I'm telepathically receiving from all of them right now. What's Reese Witherspoon really like? That's what they want to know. That's the question.
The nicest person I can imagine. It was such an honor and surprise to be picked for her book club, and I just think it's, incredible that she uses her platform to just, share these stories about women and by women writers, and it was an incredible experience. Yes.
Congratulations on that selection, too. Robin and I were just talking earlier about the whole idea of good literary citizenship, and Reese sort of embodies that in this big way of just using a platform and a presence that she has for good, for literary good, but not just for that as well. So how wonderful to be a beneficiary of that for you. So, when putting together the schedule for this and thinking about which writers I want to be part of this experience, it's really nice to always build around the idea that Drew is going to be here doing the nature walk and sort of telling us to notice the wonderment of nature and the deep time that John mentioned as well. The idea that we're here present in this moment, but other people and other animals and other plants have been here long before us, that this world has existed long before whatever moment that we're in. And all of that really relates to your writing as well. So we're going to build some bridges in our conversation here this morning. But what I find so interesting about your body of work is that woods and nature are beautiful and wonderful, but then they're all super scary as well. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your own relationship with the wilderness, why that is a theme that you return to time and time again.
Yeah, I love that question, and exactly how you phrased it is how I think about it. experiencing any setting, I believe that any setting can be either the most beautiful place in the world or the most terrifying. And it really has to do with your frame of mind, what's happened to you there or to others there, and that every place can embody all those things at once for different people. And it's really about perspective. And so my parents, when I was growing up, they were huge hikers. They still are huge hikers. Like, I am the least athletic in my family. And so we would spend every summer vacation hiking, anywhere from Maine to Virginia. My dad is from Maine and we lived in New Jersey. So we always used to just kind of craft our summer vacations around these family hiking trips. And every summer I was allowed to bring my best friend because I'm an only child. So these family vacations also have this like very strong tie in my mind to friendship, which I think is something that also comes out in the stories I write. And of course, when I turned 18, I was like, okay, I don't have to do this anymore, because I was kind of like being dragged by my parents on these hiking trips, which of course now have become like the best memories of my childhood. But I stopped doing it for a little while, and then I had kids of my own, and very quickly was like, you know what we should do? We should go hiking. And so now I was living in North Carolina, and I was able to really kind of explore this place for the first time with my family. And my husband's a big camper. I should specify that like Abby in the story, I am not a camper. I will do day hikes. But I get scared at night. So I am more of the day hiker. And it's been just this really great opportunity of reconnecting, and kind of we do these 3-generation family hikes now. When I was writing The Last House Guest, which is set in Maine, I hadn't been there since I was 18. And we took a 3-generation trip up to Maine, drove up the coast, stopping in all these little towns, and I went hiking in Bar Harbor, which is where we used to spend all of our summers up hiking in Acadia. And it was fascinating to me because I had all of these very specific memories from when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, and experiencing it again now from a parent who was bringing their child, I was seeing all these different elements, and it was like the place was existing in these 2 different time frames at once. And that gave me a lot of perspective as I was writing the story as well. So I like to see every place has a very specific history, has a history with each person as well, and almost functions as a character. Like, they all have their own relationships, their own experiences, and they become very important to pretty much every story that I write.
The idea of setting as character, sometimes even setting as antagonist, is sort of central to the way you write as well, too. And that's especially true in this book, in The Last of Vanish, which I was so drawn to when I read it, because there are some similarities to our experience here in Beaufort. This, too, is a resort town on a much smaller scale than Beaufort, and a very different location in North Carolina. But Cutter's Pass has this interesting history, and I'd love for you to sort of talk about that, the framework for the mystery element of the novel.
Yeah, so I usually start with the character as the first jumping off point into any story, and in this case, I actually started with a place, so I like to say that Cutter's Pass is the first character of this story. And so I grew up in New Jersey, but I've lived in North Carolina for about 19 years now. And my kids were born in North Carolina, and they take several class trips down to Charleston. And one of their favorite things when they would come back is to say, we took this historical ghost tour. And, it was so interesting, and I learned so much, but also, it's this historical ghost tour. And that idea kind of stuck in my mind of, what if there was a place that had this, very, long history, but what if that history was still happening right now? And this place still embraces it, and it's a very notorious history, but instead of trying to hide it, they really just kind of grip tight and they're like, yes, this is our identity, and it sort of becomes the draw of the place instead. And so the history of Cutter's Pass is that over the last 25 years, 7 visitors to the area have disappeared without a trace. So the most famous one happened 25 years ago. It was a group called the Fraternity Four. They were young men who were heading towards the Appalachian, and they were last spotted in town, and they were never seen again. And it sort of took on this life of an urban legend, which probably would have faded with time, except for this string of disappearances that continues to happen. So 10 years ago, a college woman who was part of her outdoor club saw the town of Cutter's Pass in the distance while she was hiking, headed towards it, and was never seen again. 3 years ago, a photographer in the winter was lured in by the beauty, last seen on the edge with their camera, never seen again. And most recently, a journalist who was there investigating this string of disappearances and was staying at the local inn, and he was never seen again. And as the sheriff says at this point, like, this is really bad optics. Like, he was here investigating and now he's gone. And so the town of Cutter's Pass, like, they have every one of their storefronts and their restaurants kind of like plays to this history. Like, they've renamed the bar the Last Stop Tavern because it was the last place people were seen. There's, people who live there give these, they call them historical walking tours, but it's basically taking people to the sites of these last disappearances when these are still active investigations. And so it is very much this place that people come to thinking, I can be the one to solve the mystery, but there are very real and tragic disappearances that are going on at the same time.
It's a fascinating dichotomy. Imagine running, the Chamber of Commerce, right? What's our advertisement? Hey, come to the town where everybody keeps disappearing. Maybe you'll be the one to solve it. Free pancake breakfast if you do, right? It's really fascinating. But that does happen in the world. How many of you have ever been on a ghost tour here in Beaufort or Charleston or lowcountry? If you pay attention, about like half of the stories about people who died, you're really on a murder tour, right? They just don't call it that because that's terrible branding. But that's part of the history of all these places, and there's an overarching term for that, dark tourism. It's the reason people want to go visit like Chernobyl. I mean, this happens on a global scale too, but you've sort of narrowed it down to this tiny little town of about 1,000 people, where this is it, this is their identity, this is what they've decided to lean into.
Yes. And it's a way also, I think they realize at some point, like, there's a town of 1,000 people, like, we are the suspects, So, in a way, it's also their way, I think, of deflecting to be like, well, these are all these stories that we hear out in the wilderness, and these are the things that could have happened, and it's not us. It's not us.
So, a mystery, a thriller needs a hero, it needs a detective, and your protagonist, your first-person protagonist, Abby, is really interesting. Last night at Nevermore, when I was talking to Deshaun, we mentioned how his detective kind of occupies this in-between spaces, both inside her and outside, this sort of liminal space in between. And that's sort of true of Abby as well. So could you tell us a little bit about that character and where she comes from?
Yes. When Deshaun was talking last night, I was like, that's exactly the same type of character I love to write. I find it so fascinating. Abby has lived in town for about 10 years. And she works at this local inn. She was really taken in by them, and she's treated like family. And she views this place as her home. Like, she loves this place. She has come to see it as her home. But to the people who've lived there forever and have been through all these disappearances and have it as part of their identity and have had, their parents and grandparents investigated it throughout these investigations, she's still going to be seen as an outsider. And so she has this very unique perspective because she's not quite fully an insider, but she's not one of the people who's coming just, for a week as a visitor. So she's kind of the one person who, once there's like this new piece of information, is sort of the one who's able, or the one person willing to dig into this past and bring it to the surface, but has to kind of make that decision too. Like, if I start digging into this, I know how this is going to be seen, it's not going to go over very well. And so she kind of has to have this balance, like her desire to have this home and her found family with her desire for truth and justice as well.
Such an interesting set of decisions that she has to make because she's putting so much at risk in this tiny little town where everybody knows everybody. If you go asking the wrong questions, that doesn't go unnoticed. And it definitely does not, in fact, go unnoticed in the novel. There's another character who I was really fascinated by as well, and that's Celeste, who is sort of a maternal figure, sort of a mentor figure. She kind of occupies a lot of roles in terms of her relationships with Abby. Would you talk a little bit about where she comes from and who she is as well?
Yes, I love the character of Celeste, so I'm glad that you brought her up too. So Celeste is an interesting character. So Abby works at this local inn called the Passage Inn, which is really a hallmark of this town. It's set right on the edge of the Appalachian, so people can come, stay, and then head off towards their hikes. And so they get this mix of, people coming for a visit in like a nice upscale inn, and then they also have like the cabins where hikers can kind of just come stay for the night as well. So it's a great kind of piece of the town, and it has a lot of history there. And she and her husband built this inn from scratch. She grew up in this town. She left and came back and wanted to make her home here. And she is also somebody who, I think she says to Abby at one point, like when Abby wanted a job, well, I only want people who can do the hard things. And you really have to kind of prove yourself. And she's not somebody who's ever going to give out a compliment, but you can kind of see it in the way that she treats people or the things that she entrusts to your care. And it's a little bit of tough love, but they have a very, very close relationship. She is kind of that mother figure, but also I think to the town itself. She has a strong role in this town, and also it's her vouching for Abby that basically allows her to treat this place as her own.
She is sort of Abby's introduction to the town. And Abby's relationship, the sort of triangle that forms between Celeste, Abby, and the inn, because, as you say, Celeste and her husband built the inn. It really is sort of metaphorically their child. And now she's welcomed Abby as like a daughter, so Abby and the inn are also almost siblings in this way, as they're sort of getting to know themselves and each other. And there's this whole thing with blueprints in the inn, and how, are these real rooms and where do they exist? Like, I flipped open the book hoping like there'd be a map in the inn sheets, like, where is that room in relationship to that room? And is it built into the mountain or is it not built into the mountain? But it's fascinating. There is this whole anatomy of the inn that becomes super important to the way that Abby is able to rethink, what is nefarious and what is safe, and what is home, which is really an overarching question of the novel as well. So were you drawing out the map of the inn? Does it exist fully formed in your imagination?
This does exist fully formed in my imagination. When I was writing this book, I went and stayed at various bed and breakfasts and inns set on the edge of the Appalachian Trail. So I went out to Hot Springs, I went out to a place in Virginia near the Blue Ridge, and I felt like every inn has this identity to it and a history, and a lot of them have the pictures on the walls of the process of during the build and the local materials that they used to build it. And it kind of like does grow out of the skeleton of the place. So in my mind, I do have a layout, and I did have to draw it out because at some points in the book, when things happen, you're like, where's the escape route? Like, you kind of have to, at some point, be like, and then you turn right, and then you turn left. And there is one of my books that has a map in it, and that is Such a Quiet Place, which is set in a neighborhood. And so every house kind of has different people in it. And at that point, my editor was like, well, what do you think I'm putting a map in the book? And I was like, I'm very on board for putting a map in the book. And they were like, do you have one? And I was like, yes, I drew one out. I was writing this book. And they were like, great, we'd love to see it. And you can include it. And I was like, oh no, it's not good. Like, this is not a well-drawn map. And they're like, no, it's fine. Like, we can work with it. It was like a square of paper that had like a line that said road, and it had this little cul-de-sac, and then it had like a circle, and it said lake, and then it said like woods. And I took a picture and I sent it to them, and there was like a radio sign. Like, oh yeah, this is not what we wanted it to be. But they've turned this into like this great map of the neighborhood of Hollow's Edge, which is in the front of Such a Quiet Place, which I love. But I feel like after that experience, they're no longer like, do you have a map? And can you see it? We'd love to include it in your book.
Nobody ever asked you for a map again. No. But that little square, one day that's going to be the centerpiece in the Megan Miranda Literary Center. People are going to come in, what is this? What is that? Yes, nice. Well, this actually leads nicely to another question I have, and perhaps some others have, by virtue of a little tidbit that was mentioned in your bio, too. You're an MIT graduate, and John was just up here talking about the bridges between sciences and humanities, and that's kind of how your brain works as well. But how does that impact your writing life?
Yeah, I connected to so much of what John was talking about. I'm so fascinated by so many of the same themes things as him. I went to school for biology. I always was a big reader. I loved to kind of do creative writing on my own. I feel like they're not that different. I think there is a lot more connection than people think at first. We're like, well, you started in biology, how did you end here? But I also studied anthropology while I was in college, and I feel like that was sort of this bridge of like the human side of everything I was learning on the biology side. And I've always been fascinated by, I guess, mysteries in general. And like the things that drew me to biology were like these questions that people were solving, or discoveries people were making, which is kind of the same idea as when you're reading or you're writing and you're exploring something. And especially in the case of a mystery, you're looking at the mysteries inside other people. They're just not so much like the science part of it. But I gave up writing for, I wouldn't say I gave it up. I intended to continue writing when I was in college, and the truth is I did not for about a decade. I was busy with school, and then I was busy with my job working in biotech, and then I was a high school science teacher, and then I had kids of my own. And that was sort of the moment where I was like, this is what I said I loved to do for so long. And I've been reading, I've never stopped reading though, and I said, let me try and take a real shot at finishing something. That was the big hurdle for me. I do think the process of science has helped me in my career of writing, in the way that I write, because I try to see every draft as like an experiment, and even if it doesn't work, it's getting you one step closer, like you're learning something from it. And so it's helped me when I get feedback, we're like, this just hasn't worked at all. You're like, okay, but I'm one step closer, instead of seeing it as sort of like, so it's a process, and I try to see it that way as well.
I have a chemistry background, and it's that same thing that I kind of carry with me into my humanities life now. The idea of process and experimentation, but also that problems can in fact be solved, right?
Yes.
Maybe not immediately, maybe not even by us, but eventually. There's a tremendous optimism in that as well, which I think also carries through to a lot of what I do. And it's true of your books too. They sort of lead toward a moment of optimism. We got to go down some dark trails to get there.
But I think I am an optimist at heart, even in my thrillers.
In the course of your life or your research, did you ever actually work at an inn? Have you ever done the kind of work that Abby does?
I have not, and I think this is also something that I find fascinating as a writer, is that with every book, you can do this dive into this world that you never had the chance or experience to do before, and the things that you learn about trying to figure out what their daily life is like, and even like a history of a place. When Last House Guest, which is set in Maine, at one point in my drafting process, I thought, okay, I'm going to have a character who is involved in like the lobstering industry, and so I better learn about the lobstering industry. I went out on lobster boats. I learned so much about lobstering. I watched documentaries. Do you know how many times lobster is mentioned in that book? 0 times. Actually, I think they do have like a lobster salad at one point, but like there is no actual lobstering that is made it into this book. But I feel like it's something that like creates the texture of this place, and it was important for me to know because it's important that my main character who grew up in this place would know, and that these characters would all know. So the research part is kind of something I love to do, even in the things that don't make it into the book at all. So, staying at these inns was, and even just, I was doing this in the aftermath of COVID when things were just starting to open up. And so they would, it was all no contact when we were doing it. And so it would be the list of, things that needed, like how to check in and how to check out. And we got a lot of guidance because of that. So it was just really, really interesting, but also like a fun experience. So I take my husband with me on my research trips because he loves to hike. So when I said I was doing this, he was like, and he's a backpacker. So I'm going through his bag, like, okay, we got bear spray, taking notes. So my new book, which is set in the Outer Banks, I brought him out there last year. I wanted to stay at the same time of year, which was in May. And it's like 10 p.m. and I was like, okay, it's time to go out to the beach. And I was like, why? we just saw it and like, we need to see it at night. Like, this is when my books are set. Like, you have to kind of do things or like experience things that like are when your book is setting place and seeing it in a whole different light. Like, beach is really creepy at night.
Carla Dameron, a writer friend of ours from Columbia, has done that experiment. So trying to get in the head of a character, just live a whole day as that character, right?
Yeah.
Well, what is she doing at 9:45? Well, she's having coffee. Okay, what kind of coffee is she having? And just sort of live the whole day, but you do have to kind of immerse yourself into as close of the experience as the character is having as you can to kind of live that.
I do, yeah. For the setting, I think it's really important and like what their job is or what their role is in the community.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your forthcoming book, which is this, The Only Survivors, which comes out about a month from now, almost to the day, really. Why the Outer Banks? What's your interest in the Outer Banks?
So I have this ongoing joke with my long-term editor that I'm always either setting a book in the woods or near the water. And so I just wrote a book in the woods, and I was like, well, we're going back to the water now. And, I find, like, for me, there are places of peace, both of those. Like, I find so much peace in both the mountains and the woods and also by the ocean. I love the ocean. Every time I see the water, it's like this breath, just, this cleansing breath comes over me. And then as a thriller writer, you're basically trying to see all of, like, how can this place now become terrifying instead? And so I knew I wanted to have a place that could become isolated. So this was a refuge for these characters who convene in this house every year for a decade. It was their place of safety, and it was called The Shallows, and it's surrounded by, like, the endless deep. And then when something goes wrong, when one of them goes missing, like, how can all these things be turned against you instead? And I wanted a place that could really become isolated very quickly. And that has been my experience, and, how quickly a bridge can shut, where a road can close. And suddenly what had been a refuge is now a trap instead. So that was my creepy inspiration.
I think it must be fascinating to view that world there. And I know other mystery writers and thriller writers who do that and sort of step into a room for the first time and think, oh, this is beautiful. There are so many ways to die in this room. This is great. I love everything about this.
Well, I will tell you the inspiration point for this, for The Only Survivors, was I was on a family vacation in Puerto Rico where my husband is from. We were visiting family, and we were out for a walk on the beach. And this phone washed up in the surf. It just washed up at his feet. It had like a case still on it that was cracked, and it was like it was dead. And we brought it back and laid it out in the sun to see if they could like bring it back to life and figure out like who it belonged to. And I came back later, and my teenage daughter was like, I plugged it in and it works. And they were all excited, and all I could think was like, this is a terrible idea. Like, this is evidence of a crime, obviously. And we have just turned it on and given everyone like insight.
Location details. Yes.
Yes. And they're like, that's not a normal way to think about things. It's helpful as a thriller writer, maybe not in like daily life, but
Boundaries are important.
Yeah.
I mean, you gotta draw some lines there. Yes. But I'd love to just sort of continue down this path and talk about what is the anatomy of a good plot twist? Because this shows up time and time in your books, and it's something that reviewers and readers have really associated with you, is that you can kind of, you do this thing so well where every possibility seems real and valid, so you're not expecting the thing that's going to happen when it happens. And just as you've had a moment to recover, like, oh, I can't believe that just happened, something else happens. And it's every bit as striking as powerful, and you do it so well. Even if readers are associating this with you and your writing style, you still carry it off every single time. So how do you do that? What's the magic?
So, okay, I don't know if there's magic. I think my secret is that when I start a book, I have no idea what's going to happen. And so because I write first person, I think it's very helpful to connect to that uncertainty, where from the main character's perspective, all these possibilities do exist, and any one of these people could have done it, and everyone might have a motive, but what's the thing throughout the story that pushes somebody to that, twist or reveal? And when I'm thinking about twists, I don't think about them like I'm going to do a surprise. I think about it like I'm going to reveal a piece of information, or there's going to be like something that you didn't know that suddenly you know. And that's kind of how I start to plot the book out, is not by like the external plot of what's going to happen, but what are you going to learn in this section? And sometimes it's what the reader learns, but a lot of times it's what the narrator learns, and when those kind of come together is, I think, when you have that like big aha moment. But I figure a book out as I'm going. I figure out who did it as I'm going, and so editing is a huge part of my process, because once you figure out who did it, then like you gotta go back and make sure that's all in there. And I also like to think about not just the external plot, but the mysteries that are inside each character, and that you have the opportunity to unwind each of these things inside every character in the book, and how do those all kind of contribute and change and shift the character's perspectives. Because I think so much of a twist is just a change in perspective.
It's that sudden reveal of new information that makes you revisit the information you thought you had in a new way.
Yeah.
And I love a twist that makes the reader do the thing that you just described you do as writing, that you actually now have to go back and kind of retrace and say, oh, I did notice that, and I didn't understand the importance of it at the time, but there it was. Last night when I was talking to Deshaun on stage about his second book, First Mystery, Decent People, he mentioned, he decided from the onset we're going to have this triple homicide and everybody's going to be a suspect. And in the course of writing it, he was just having so much fun getting to know all these suspects, he forgot that at some point somebody's actually going to have to solve this crime.
That is, I think, like a hard part too. Like, you set up this counter, like there's 7 missing people. What fun! And then you're like, oh God, I have to figure out how these all connect at some point, and like why the police couldn't solve this for 25 years.
It does all have to make sense in a way that's rewarding for the reader, and it does. Every disappearance has a resolution, and the tapestry between them, sort of how the pieces all fit together, make interesting sense in a way that then also explains this sort of interior struggle that Abby is having, and things she hasn't necessarily known about herself that now become apparent as we near the end of the story as well. So everything sort of ties up beautifully. And you do a thing that the editor, Shannon Ravenel, founder of Algonquin Books, co-founder, who was one of Pat's editors early on, to kind of advise writers to do. I think she was talking specifically to our friend George Singleton when she gave this advice. She said, in a good story, the ending has to kiss the beginning, meaning it has to kind of complete the circle. And she told George, I think, that his ending was French kissing in the beginning. You probably need to dial it back a little bit. But there is this sort of perfect circle in this book where we end with a scene that's very parallel to how we begin, but now we have Abby who knows this new set of information about herself and about the town. And is that intentional? Were you writing toward a particular scene, or did you realize in the course of writing it, this is where the trail needed to come back around?
Yes and no, and also I love that you said, where the trail comes back around, because I think a lot about structure when I'm writing stories, and like, who's the right narrator for a story, and also what's the right way to tell this story. And this book is structured around the missing cases, so it starts with the most recent, which is the journalist. The book is told linearly, but it starts with Landon West, gives the details of his disappearance, and that's sort of the first case that people are dipping into. And then as Abby discovers a piece of information, it takes you to part 2, which is the next most recent disappearance, and that's how it keeps moving back until you get to the Fraternity 4. And I structured it that way because I saw it as a trail myself, and the working title for this book at first was The Vanishing Trail. And that is what they had called this trail behind their house that leads to Appalachian, where everyone's going missing. And so I did see the story that was structured almost like this trail that she was following. And at some point, I don't necessarily see the end of like the story plot in my head, but I see the character arc. And so I did know about halfway through that was the scene I wanted to write at the very end as the place I was getting to for her. It's not so much about the plot, but it's very much about her and her role and her relationship with this place. And so I do try to have that when I'm writing. I'll usually have like the end character scene as the place I'm working toward.
That makes sense, and the trail metaphor certainly holds up too in terms of the structure of the novel and the structure of the writing also. Even though these moments are 10 million years apart, as John described earlier, there's also this idea of deep time, of being in a space, or in this case, a space that Abby has been in many times, but that's not the same Abby anymore. It's an Abby who has a broader understanding of herself in this place. And there's an earlier moment like that, too, where Trey has come to kind of try and find out what has happened to his brother Landon, and is just insistent on being in the same room in the inn and occupying the same space, because this is a space that's had that dark history where his brother was present, and he's trying to sort of, feel that and understand the importance of it too. But you do that a couple of times where people end up in spaces, well, really that's kind of the whole model of the town, to come to a space where something bad has happened and stand there and sort of think about what that means for you. But were you sort of intentionally peppering the novel with those moments where people are occupying spaces that are true to a relative or a history that's going to relate to their life in addition to what happened there previously?
I was so invested in everything that John was saying about time for that same reason, because I think it's just something that fascinates me on multiple levels as well, and it's probably a theme in a lot of my books, especially books that I have a book that moves in reverse, and I've been thinking a lot about the different ways people try to understand time, and in All the Missing Girls, it's structured around philosopher quotes. Her father was a philosopher, and that divides each section, and it's the way that philosopher views time. But I was also really intrigued by the way, time works as like a function of math and science as well, and how do we kind of have I'm rambling, all these different understandings of the different ways that time works. And so time is something I'm fascinated by in many ways and try to explore in different ways. And in this book, yes, I feel like characters being drawn back to these same points where you can stand, and like you were saying, all of this history exists in this same place, like right where we are now. Like all these things are existing at once. As you're peeling back the layers, and do you feel something when you're standing there? Do you get a new understanding or perspective by being in these same places at different moments? And I think that's what a lot of characters are drawn to this place for, and it's something that I'm just endlessly fascinated by and don't have answers for, but it's like the thing that makes me curious to explore it more.
I read an interview you did for an earlier book, I don't think for The Last of Vanish, where you said sort of an overarching plot point or theme of all of your books is the past returns, is that this thing that we thought we were beyond is now back, and now we got to deal with it. There's a reckoning that comes back around each time too. Are you leaning into that? Is that something that you were trying to write toward, or does it just sort of happen organically in each book?
I think it started organically. It's something I'm endlessly fascinated by. And I think it started because I started writing young adult fiction. I was writing suspense about these things that happened to characters when they were like 16, 17 years old. These huge moments that, could affect the trajectory of their lives. And, at the end, the character makes their way through. The book is done. I like to think the characters are doing okay. And then, years later, I would be talking to people about them and kind of wondering, I wonder how they're doing. Do they try and leave the past behind? Do they embrace it? Does it become part of their story? Do they try to bury it? And it's something that I've thought a lot about with every one of my books in the adult market that has since come. And so I think it's something that I love to explore, and I do it in a different way in each book. And every character has their own relationship. I'm escaping my past. I tried to leave it behind. Or, in the case of the girl from Little Hills, that's what she was known as a child. She was the center of a huge media story, and she was the girl from Little Hills. She will always be that. So it has become a huge theme in my book. It's the theme of this book. It's definitely a theme of my next one. It's about the survivors of something that happened when they were 18, and they've been getting together every year since. And now this is the 10-year reunion, and kind of you're having a new understanding of that past. I think that's what I'm interested in too, not just how the past influences the present, but how the present can shift your understanding of the past. And that as we get older and we see things from a different perspective, it can kind of click the past into a different understanding. And that's something that fascinates me with memory too, the way you have a very strong memory of something and someone else can have an entirely different memory of that same situation, where you learn one new piece of information and it just changes the whole story that your mind has created for it.
We hosted a writer from Savannah as part of March 4th a couple of years ago, Bruce Feiler, who mostly does nonfiction, actually exclusively nonfiction, but the book he had at the time is called Life is in the Transitions, and he describes these life-quake moments, that we think of things as being linear time, all of that. We talk about child development and, the arc of a story, and the hero's quest is the sort of thing that plays out. But that's not really true of our experiences. We're upended by the thing that we don't see coming, by the real-life plot twist. And that resets our thinking and who we are from that moment onward in unexpected ways. And that's something that I see in every one of your books that I've read. It really is true to our lived experiences, even if we don't always recognize it that way.
And I think people can have very different reactions to the same event, which was what I was interested in for this new book, was like, okay, you all went through the same thing, but how do 8 people react to that completely differently? And thinking about that, like, yes, it's the life quake that you were saying that splits everyone, but everyone has a different reaction to that as well.
I'm really enjoying it, and I get to review it for the Post and Courier, so I get to enjoy it in print, which is even more fun. But it's reminding me a little bit of a book that came out maybe 2 years ago called The Final Girl Support Group by a writer from Charleston, Grady Hendricks, who we've posted a couple of times. It's about the idea of, you've survived this terrible event. Okay, who are you 10 years later? How does that continue to inform your life? And if you're part of a community of survivors, what holds that group together? Is it just the tragedy that links you together, or are there the friendships and the connections beyond that? So even though the books are very dissimilar in every other way, I'm noticing that sort of central thread through it, And I want to open this to audience questions because we have a very bright and wonderful, intelligent audience here as well. But I do have one more question I want to ask before we see what their questions might be. In the last of Vanish, and in I think all of your books that I've read, it's first-person narrative. So we the readers only get to know what that character knows. We don't get to know anything beyond that, and we get to learn it when, in this case, she learns it. So we're really deep into that mindset. What draws you as a writer to writing that way?
That's a great question. In one way, I think it's like just my natural impulse when I start writing. That's kind of what I'm drawn to doing. But I think also, like, as we were talking about different experiences that I have not had, that these characters have, and the things they go through in their daily life, that I have not had those same experiences, the one thing that I feel like I can always connect to is an emotion. And if I can understand the fear or the uncertainty or the love, or like that connects me to the character and makes me understand their choices that they make. And that for me is the quickest way to do it, is to write from that headspace, try to connect to that emotion. And then no matter what the story's about, and thankfully I've not had any of these tragic thriller stories happen in my real life, I feel like I can still write it authentically because I have felt, a sliver of what they have felt in all these different moments.
So that's the foundation that makes the character real for you, and then therefore makes it real for the reader as well. Oh, I appreciate that. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
Do we have a great question now? Do we have any questions from our audience? Oh, Shirley, yes, please.
I have the pleasure of teaching freshman English at USCB, and I'm very thankful for their curriculum that they allow you to teach for 102, which is heavy literature. One of the things, especially when we go into fiction, that I have students focus on is the role of the minor character. And very often we get so involved with our major characters that we miss that really important moment, be it a
great question, and it's such an important part of kind of the whole world that these characters embody. And characters are my favorite part of writing, and I think it's that discovery process of you learn every character has a different relationship, not only with setting, but every other character in the book. And that's how I start by doing it, is I'm not someone who knows my characters until I really start writing them. And that goes for the side characters as well. I feel like they develop based on their interactions and their history with the main character that I'm writing from. But I also really try to see that even if their story isn't making it onto the page, that every single one of these characters could have the book focus on them instead. And to think about what their story would be. And I do think that a lot of my books, I could shift the main character to one of the side characters, and it would be a different story, but it would still be a story with an arc to it. And so I try to see that every character has that arc and feels real to me as well. Thank you for that question.
John's got a question right here.
I'm fascinated by this point of view question, and I was just wondering if you feel that you're going to struggle with this at some point in your writing career. Like, one of the most frustrating experiences I had as a novelist in both my novels was I would get through an entire draft and move from first person to third, and then move it back to first person. I mean, back and forth, not knowing what the point of view was, and struggling to get to that point of view. And then, would you think you're ever going to go through this dark night of the soul? Where you're gonna...
I think I just did with my last book, actually. Definitely, like, I think because it really depends, like, what is the right way to tell a story, and it's not the same. I do feel like you could tell a story so many different ways, and you get something different each time. You're revealing something different. So what is the thing you're trying to reveal? So for The Only Survivors, which is a large cast of characters, I knew I was going to be I have flashbacks from every one of the characters' perspectives in the past between each chapter. And so originally when I talked to my editor about the idea, I thought the book should probably be all in third person. That's probably how the book is going to work best. And I wrote 20 pages, and it just was like, it wasn't feeling right. I wasn't hitting my groove with it, and I thought, okay, whose story is this really, and why? And I started writing in first person again, and it started flowing, but I kept the flashback chapters in third person, so that I could show something from each of these unique perspectives that kind of changes the understanding throughout. So that's the first time I've actually done third person in a book. I've done dual narrators before. In one of my young adult books, The Last House Guest, I started as two narrators, wrote the whole book, turned it in, wasn't quite working. I thought the right way to fix this was by adding a third narrator, like a detective overseeing it all. Wrote that entire book, did not work. Went up to Maine with my family, kind of immersed myself in that, and realized, no, this is one person's story. The thing that's changing is time and perspective. And then that shifted to be a dual timeline, but one narrator book. So, I mean, that one took me like an extra year to write, because I went through a few drafts first, but I think you're right. Like, it depends, and it depends on the story, and I obviously feel like I'm drawn to being able to tell something in the first person that I don't have the same skill as maybe in the third person, but who knows if that's going to change over time.
Does occupying a character's persona like that for such a long period of time, of course, of writing the book, sort of make them linger in your imagination a little longer too?
Yes, and I think the books that linger with me the longest are the ones I spent the longest on, probably for that reason. All the Missing Girls, which is my first book for adults, it was my second book idea. I knew I wanted to tell a story in reverse, and I had this idea, and I started thinking of the characters. It was my sixth published novel, so if that gives any indication of how long those characters lived in my head, even before I could get their story out. And I will still think about those characters to this day. And same for Last House Guest, because it took me so many drafts, and you just feel like you know so much more about these characters because, oh, I wrote that character's point of view in what draft. They just didn't make it into the final version.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah. So what's the longest amount of time that you spent writing a particular book? Is it?
Probably, I would say it's All the Missing Girls, but I wasn't actively writing it for those 6 years. I come up with the idea, I started with a young adult book, I wrote about 40 words and it wasn't 40 pages and it wasn't working. Put it aside, wrote the book that was under contract, but I kept coming back to it. It was like the idea that would leave me alone, and I have like many versions of the first 50 pages, but then suddenly something clicked and I realized how to tell it and who was the narrator and what they were running from, and then I wrote that in about a year. So I'd say it averages me about a year to write, but sometimes longer to figure out the structure.
That's good to know. You've got such good self-awareness as a writer, too. Probably developed over time, I would imagine. The ongoing experiments, right?
I feel like I sort of embraced the things that I wish I could plot, right? Like I wish I could plot up front and not have to do all the revisions. And I have friends who put in all the work before and get their outlines and then are able to draft quicker. And I feel like now I just embrace those things about my process because I know it's my process. And so even when it's not working, I'm like, okay, I've been here before. Eventually, I think I'll dig myself out of here.
Deshaun and I have had those conversations too. He loves his characters. He falls in love with them, and he particularly loves hearing them talk to each other. By which I mean writing their dialogue together. But then you realize, something should probably happen, right? This should probably advance the narrative at some point. We can't just spend all day having this conversation in the kitchen. But plotting is a challenge if you're a character-driven person, and I think. I mean, it may happen over time in the course of editing, but the way you land is on a novel that is equally character-driven and plot-driven. They're both of equal importance, I would say, and that's difficult to do, but you do it really well.
I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Yes, Margaret.
Your stories all sound so fascinating to me. I'm wondering if there's any interest out there. I would love to stream one of these stories on Netflix or something. Is anybody trying to produce your books as...
I have a few that have been under option. They have not yet been to the point of announced on the streamer, but I do have a couple that are in the works. One, The Last House Guest, was optioned by Dakota and Elle Fanning, and I know somebody's been working on turning that into a series. So I would be so excited to see any of the books brought to life in another medium and get to experience it that way, but just keeping fingers crossed.
Absolutely.
Have your friend Reese make a call.
Okay.
Yes, Mary, and then we'll come up here. So
Following up Jonathan's first question and his just most recent comment, how did your book get to Reese Witherspoon, and what is the process for making that happen?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I only found out a couple of months beforehand. I think, it was obviously submitted probably by my publisher. And it was, I'm still my mind is blown. So I had for Last House Guest, my book had come out. I had just gotten back from a leg of tour, and my phone rang on a Saturday, and I saw it was my editor. And I'm like, why is my editor calling on the weekend? See, there's something really good or something really bad. And she was like, Reese Witherspoon picked your book for her book club. And I said, I'm sorry, what? Can you repeat that several times? And so that was going to be in August, and I was told, I couldn't say anything yet. So I buried that deep inside and told not a soul because I'm a very bad secret keeper. So, and then I knew it was going to be announced on Instagram August 1st, and ready to take a screenshot and send it to my family and her big family text. And by the time it was posted, and I took a screenshot, half my family was like, Megan, did you know? Did you see this? Everyone in my family called us Reese Witherspoon. So it was incredibly exciting and a whirlwind, and I don't know the entire inner workings of it, but entirely grateful for that.
So can't be replicated on the fly. It's not a push button, but it's really exciting, and how wonderful that your family sort of celebrated in that way too, and wondered whether you knew too. I like that. That's the best part of the story. Yes, this will be our last question.
I just had a question before you began writing, or even when at MIT. Were there certain crime series or certain authors that you followed, or
mystery and suspense. Like my mom was a big mystery reader. Like bookshelves at home were full of those, and so she used to bring me to the library every Thursday, which is her day off, and I would just kind of like stacks of books. And I think I started with like Nancy Drew, and then I quickly in middle school discovered Edgar Allan Poe, which just spoke to something like it was a weird middle school transition from Nancy Drew to Edgar Allan Poe, but I just really
Middle school kids are like totally like that.
but I also I had a teacher give me Jurassic Park, which was the perfect book to give to me, a kid who loved science and loved thrillers and mysteries, and that was a writer that kind of opened my mind to different things that I could write about and experiences. Harlan Coben is a longtime favorite. I love his mystery series, the Myron Bolitar series, which is kind of they have a blend of wit and mystery. Tana French is another of my favorites. If you've read the Dublin Murder Squad series, they're so everyone follows a different detective in the squad, and every case is perfectly suited for this detective and having to unwind the mysteries of their lives, and they're just so beautifully written. But yeah, I could go on and on.
And that one was?
Tana French is the Dublin Murder Squad series. So the first one is called In the Woods. The second is The Likeness. I think there's 5 or 6 of them. And
The other one was
Harlan Coben.
Could I ask just one question?
Yes, absolutely.
I
Kim.
want to know what happened with that box.
It was not a piece of a crime, allegedly. We did trace it back. Well, I didn't, because I was still sure this was a crime. So it kept rebooting, and we couldn't see anything in it other than the last photo taken was on a jet ski in the ocean, and I was like, this is obviously evidence. But we were able to find the emergency contact, which was Dad, and so my husband texted it, and we had lost the phone 2 weeks earlier on vacation, on a jet ski. I'm how did it survive for 2 weeks? We brought it back with us and mailed it back to them, so it did make its way home. It was not evidence of a crime, but it inspired.
But now that could be a commercial for whatever brand of phone you have, right? Because it's
Yeah, 2 weeks.
And I'm glad we were able to answer that unanswered question for you too. That
Mystery
may
that
have
has been
been
resolved.
See, problems do have solutions sometimes, yes. Well, I want to thank Megan for sharing this hour with us, and I want to thank all of you for sharing this hour with us as well. She's going to be signing books right back here with our friends at Nevermore Books, and then we'll resume with our final author presentation about 15-20 minutes from now. So thank you so much, Megan.